My channel has hundreds of individual videos that explain and demonstrate a technique for drawing detail freehand directly in pen, whether it's grand architecture or more humble architecture, whether it's trees, whether it's the detail of corrugated iron roofing or flagged verandas, a panoramic landscape, some old weathered stones in a bush pathway, or finely carved stones in an impressive architectural pediment, or very weathered stones in a large, ruined, hundreds-of-year-old abbey. It might be the detail in a gilded chandelier, or a field of tulips, or a more tangled natural bush scene. It may focus in on the rough surface of a tree trunk, or a finely detailed architectural structure of some sort. It may be the detail of gravel scattered on the ground, or of old stone blocks. They may be stacked together to form a house. Or the detail may be a street moving away from us. Every one of these drawings employs the same general technique. But rather than make another video showing the application of this drawing technique, I wanted to focus instead on trying to explain the mental processes, the way of thinking, which is fundamental to being able to draw this way. You can copy the marks I make for certain subjects, but that won't necessarily let you draw that way for a different subject. But if you come to understand how I'm thinking when I draw this way, then you can use that thinking to draw any subject that you want. Firstly, I want to make very clear what the problem is with drawing detail. And while the, if you like, more natural way we can think about the drawing process proves to be inadequate when we come up against detail. But then I want to shift to my drawing journey and how I was to work out a different way of thinking, a different way of drawing, I came to realize was the key to being able to capture so many subjects effectively. So firstly, what's the problem with drawing detail? Why is it so challenging? Well, by definition, it usually has the idea of lots of very small things together very closely over a large area. I think the easiest subject to think about the challenge of drawing detail is one that's a big problem for many people when they start to draw, and that's trees. The problem is so much of it is made up by leaves, and leaves become the overwhelming detail that is challenging to draw in a satisfactory way. Now, leaves are relatively simple structures. We know what a leaf looks like, and we can draw most leaves quite easily. But how do we draw so many of them? And nature brings up lots of similarly difficult subjects because of detail. A lawn of grass, how do we draw all the blades of grass? A field of flowers, how do we draw all the flowers? And perhaps some of us have spent hours trying to draw all the detail, and yet somehow for all that effort, it never ends up looking very realistic. One problem when we start to draw detail, such as bricks in a wall, is that once we start, where do we stop? And before we know it, we've got a massive inky lines over our whole wall that took a long time, that have been hard to get precisely straight, and where we now don't see the wall because all we see is the black ink of our brick lines. Well, that's enough of the problem. But how can we overcome this? How can we think differently to find an answer to representing these challenging but common drawing subjects? I'll start by saying we're not just wanting to think differently about drawing detail, we actually need to think differently about drawing itself, about drawing anything, simple or complex. If we think back to when we start drawing, we start by drawing things as children. We draw a face, we draw a cat, we draw a figure, and then we start to combine them together to create a scene. We draw a house with a daddy, with a mummy, with a someone, with a this, with a that, with a cat, with some flowers, with a chimney, with smoke, with a sun in the sky and with clouds. And it's the thinking that produces this drawing, which I think is often still the thinking that's swirling around in the back of our head when we start to draw as adults. And while this childhood way of thinking about drawing can work for relatively simple subjects. It shows its shortcomings when we want to tackle more challenging and more complex subjects. The change in my thinking about the drawing process wasn't something I consciously did. It came about as I tried to tackle various drawing challenges. But its starting point was 10 years before I even started to draw, when I first began to paint. And I realised that as I was painting my tree canopies, which was my main subject when I first started painting, that I wasn't trying to paint individual leaves at all. I was painting the overall impression that the leaves created when we looked at them en masse. I was painting the canopy overall, and I had to try and see the overall canopy and disconnect from seeing individual leaves. In fact, I had to work hard not to suggest individual leaves with my paintwork, with my brushwork, because that would change our perception of the size, of the scale of the tree. But when I started drawing architecture, but found that often required me to draw trees as well, I found that I was going back to my way of thinking when I painted trees. Even though I now was using a line from a pen or a pencil rather than a brush, using swathes of colour and value, that my approach for drawing trees came back to the same way of thinking, which was that I wasn't trying to put on the paper actual leaves. I was trying to create the overall effect of the tree canopy, but using the marks I could make with a pen instead, which was usually by hatching to capture the shadows and the shade. So I was never tempted to try and start drawing the outlines of leaves, or draw lots of leaves together, or evolve that into a pattern, a leaf pattern, which would represent leaves. My painting experience steered me down what I think was a far more effective direction. So I'm looking for the three-dimensional form of the canopy. I'm looking for the way the surface of all those leaves together looks when the light hits it. And this changes from tree to tree. It changes from the distance I am from the tree, the shapes of the leaves, the way the leaves hang off the branches, the way the branches distribute the leaves across the overall canopy. It's not, this is the tree canopy technique, but these are the drawing principles that can be applied to whatever tree canopy we have, whatever variety of tree we have, however close or far it is, whatever the light is. I also realised, though, that I was starting to transfer this way of thinking to other non-foliage subjects. Even in my architecture drawings that I was doing for Instagram, often with incredible interior architectural decorative detail, I didn't actually realise that this is what I was doing until I had a comment where someone said to me, I zoomed in on your drawing to have a good look at all the detail, and then to my surprise, it wasn't there. And that got me thinking, well, yes, I knew I didn't draw all the detail, but I hadn't quite worked out that what I was doing was drawing the feel of the detail, capturing the essence of the detail, rather than drawing the precision, all of the detail. But once this comment triggered, if you like, explicit understanding of what I was doing in these architectural interior scenes, I found I was actually able to go with it. I was able to more consciously utilize this drawing technique. Understanding the technique I'd been developing helped me to apply it further in new ways with new subjects. And I think the real breakthrough came when I came to understand that this wasn't just a way of thinking to enable me to draw detail. This was the way of thinking for absolutely everything I drew. Because in fact, everything has a certain visual effect. What it's made of, what the surface texture is, what the edges are like, how far away it is, what the light's like, what the colour is, the overall condition that it's in. Has it been weathered a long time or damaged in some way? And not just how far away is it, but where is it in my scene? Is it the focus of attention, or is it on the edges? They can all impact the visual effect of the object that I'm seeing. So therefore, in my drawing, I want to capture all of these things with what I put on the paper. And because these things all capture, if you like, the reality of what I'm seeing in life in some way, the more successful I am in capturing them, the more realism will be injected into my drawing. The more my drawing will have the feel of being real, because I've been able to capture the effect of reality of seeing these things that happens in life. But in order to think this way, I have to shift my thinking from the natural childhood way of thinking. I'm no longer thinking, oh, I'm looking at an object that has a shape and I need to copy that shape using lines on my paper. Because objects in reality have far more than just shape, than just outline. Firstly, their form, they're three-dimensional. And that affects the way different parts of the one object will look. And thinking of subjects that we draw as objects to draw an outline for, our biggest challenge is to draw the outline accurately. And yet that can still end up with a very cartoon-like looking effect, because that's not adequate for how things look in life. Things in life are not just an outline. In fact, the outline might be quite unnoticeable compared to other visual effects that we see when we look at this object. But if we think in this childhood way, we end up dividing things that we draw into hard things and easy things. The easy things are the relatively simple things that we can outline more easily. The hard things are things like leaves and grass on the ground, where there's just too many things and we become overwhelmed with drawing all the little objects that we know are there. And what about things such as reflections in a shop window? That's not actually a thing. You can't pick up a reflection and walk around it. It's easy to think that we can't draw those things because we lack the technical ability to put the marks on the paper. The problem's not in our drawing skill. The problem is in the way we're thinking about these objects. We're thinking about them from a childhood way of understanding drawing that doesn't give us any way to draw these sorts of things. But if instead of thinking about objects, I'm thinking about visual effect, that everything has a visual effect when I look at it in life. And for some things, the outline, the silhouette edging, if you like, of the object or of various facets of it may be prominent. My challenge as an artist is to perceive visually what the effect, for whatever reason, of various objects scattered throughout my scene are, and to try and capture those with what I put on the paper. I'm not trying to outline an object. I'm trying to capture the feel of something, the visual impact effect of something that I see. And once I realize that everything is, if you like, an effect, it's not just grass or leaves. Even things that look relatively solid, such as this dark tree that we see almost silhouetted because of the lighting and the shadows behind me, that simply becomes part of the visual effect that I draw in a certain way using lines, where drawing more of an outline for parts of it would be an appropriate way of capturing that visual effect, but less successful for capturing the grass or the shadows on the grass. But there was a second seismic shift in my thinking. It wasn't just shifting from realizing that I wasn't looking at objects, I was looking at certain visual effects on the objects or from the objects. There was a second shift that had to happen, and it was when the two of these combined that everything really fell into place, and I felt I really began to flow with this new way of thinking in my actual drawings and see the results in my drawings that I'd been after but hadn't quite been able to pull together. And that was, I stopped thinking about drawing as happening through drawing lines on the paper, and I began to think of my drawing rather as happening through my putting marks on the paper. The lines became a type of mark which I would often use, but it was only one type of mark amongst many. Because once I stopped thinking of drawing as outlining shapes, where lines is a more natural way of thinking of doing that, but as I began to realize, no, I'm not defining shapes by outlining them. I'm trying to capture the effect of how this shape, this object looks in life. And I began to realize that I did that by creating an effect on my paper, Suddenly lines, outlining was not nearly so helpful. But to think of marks, any marks that I could make with what I was using with my pen, whether it was lines or dots or dashes or splashes or curls or whatever, or even the spaces, the gaps I left between all of these marks. That this is how I created my effect, by putting all these marks on the paper. My primary way of thinking is not I'm outlining shapes, although shapes will invariably be created when I put the marks on the paper and combine them in certain ways. So I keep talking about the visual effect of something. What is that visual effect? And how does it differ to just all the things that are in the photo? Well, in many ways, it's less than all the things that are in the photo. When I talk about the visual effect, I'm talking about the way things look when I look at this scene in life, in fact, not in the photo. When I look at a photo, I need to recognize that it's not quite showing me how things look in life. There's no depth for a start. And we see a lot more detail in a photo than we take in life when we look at the same scene. Because in life, we invariably have a focal point. And we see that focal point more clearly, and we see the things less clearly as they move away. So if I want to capture the effect of reality, then I want to capture with my marks the way things look when they're in the focal point, but also the way things change in terms of our perception as they move further away, as we see them less clearly, with less care, because that reflects reality. And as I began to try and capture this in my drawing with the marks I was using, because lines were inadequate for this, my drawings began to capture more of a sense of realism, because I'm more accurately capturing how things feel visually, how they look, the effect that they have in life. Can you understand how this opens up a whole new way of actually capturing light effects, such as the wonderful one behind me? How the idea of outlining shapes is going to be so inadequate to try and capture the feel of this in my drawing. And yet if I'm thinking marks to create effect, I have a lot more tools now to use. And exploring light effects in natural settings such as this is something I'm particularly enjoying doing at the moment in my pen drawing. And yet just a few years ago, I could never have conceived of being able to draw a scene such as the one behind me using a black ink pen. It's because I now think in this way about the drawing process that I'm able to create the drawings that I create. Please hit the like button for me, and why not share this video with any friends you have who draw. The more I've come to understand exactly how this process has been working for me, and I've been able to go with it and develop it further, the more I've seen my drawings change and evolve in ways that bring me more satisfaction, because I'm more able to capture what I'm seeing in my mind before I put the ink on the paper. I really suggest you listen to this a second time, because you were still thinking of the previous thing I just said. And then go to either my playlist on drawing trees or my playlist on drawing the effect of detail and watch a few of the drawing videos to see me put this into practice, particularly the more recent drawings, because I'm more consciously using what I've just explained in my more recent drawings. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you've understood this. If this sounds like an exciting new thing you could try, I'd be encouraged very much to hear that in the comments. But in the end, whatever you draw, however you draw it, this way or any other way, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.